now let's take a look at another game from roughly the same period, a little bit after, mid-2000s, I think. It's been through a little bit of drama, publication-wise. What I have here is the first attempt of Promised Sands from, at the time, BB Rack Games Productions. It's been through a little bit of, as I say, publication drama, and is currently in post-Kickstarter hiatus. So at this time, though, I want to think about Promised Sands as an excellent example, as with Undiscovered, of putting half-breeds, hybrids, into some kind of powerful cultural and setting context that just cries out, play me. So to summarize the game a bit, we're talking about a fantasy game, except that, like some, the conceit is that it's post-apocalyptic and that we are looking at the transformed landscape over a forgotten northwestern Midwest that is now a fantasy landscape, more or less, with a very strong desert motif. In fact, they've kind of play a little game. If you aren't paying too much attention and look at the game, you say, well, Arabian fantasy. And it takes a little bit of squinting and you suddenly realize that you're looking at the transformed American Midwest. Well, okay. You've got a wide range of races. Like many of these games, the vagaries of post-apocalyptic crisis upon the former humans has generated results that are surprisingly elf and dwarf-like. And so this has been done many times in fantasy, and that's fine. Unlike the sort of divine creation mythological history of something like Undiscovered, but the effect is the same. Well, what we have here then is this panoply of races, and they're, the Suvik and the Andwar are, you'll recognize these from the orcs and trolls of Earth Dawn. They're short, tusky humans, and then the others are shorter and stronger and tuskier, and so you've got that. Then you've also got the Sill, who divide very nicely into the Ebon Sill in their secretive tunnels and their vicious guild wars and stuff like that. And then you've got the regular Sill, who are more sylvan, woodsy, and then you've got the sort of nice and peaceful subset of them who are very much kind of the hippie groovy, really, really benevolent ones. Well, you have that, and then you also have the sort of the more or less human stock, the Roland, who are burly humans, and then you've got their offshoot, the Numid, who are a little more kind of effete and civilized and so on, and they've got these weird plates on their heads that conserve water and breathe for them and stuff. So all that is nicely set up recently as well in the setting. You have people who went deep into the ocean arcologies, with deep underwater, into their weird little artificially constructed environments there, and they rode out the nuclear conflagration and are now just kind of coming up to see what the world is like for the first time. And they're called the denizens, as in, the denizens of the deep, I guess. And some of them culturally have moved onto land and are called the dry denizens. And the ones that are still living underwater but occasionally appear looking around are the wet denizens. That's the racial broad strokes of the game. But what about two things? First is that the game is very clear about designating cultures with their own names. And the game does a remarkable job of showing that the cultures may have originated with a given race or ethnicity, more appropriately with some particular confluence and hierarchy of local ethnicities. And that's how the culture originated, but over the decades and over the centuries has become, through contact with everybody else and with whatever has happened historically, has loosened up a little bit. And now you can find almost any race that could, on an individual basis, have been brought up in almost any of the cultures. Wet denizens are probably the only real exception to that. So that therefore a culture may be associated with a given race or a given hierarchy of races, but in practice there's a lot of off and on. You can see my notations for it are actually pretty straightforward in the attached file. But it's very consistent with historical understandings of these things and is quite refreshing to read in that regard. So even that right there, I think, is a big strength of the setting. Then you look at the next issue, which is that recently you are seeing more and more visible and finally acknowledged reality of offspring across the races. The exceptions, of course, are the races that aren't even human in stock, which are the the mutated horses and the mutated cats. I'm kind of leaving those out of the discussion. But in the case of the majority of the races, yes, they are cross-fertile, and those individuals tend to be very, very visually distinctive because of the radical changes across, these ethnic/species splits among humanity. And so these individuals are really, really distinctive looking, and they also tend to have, for whatever reason, whether it is physiological or the fact that they culturally don't fit, they tend to have very characteristic and very extreme outlooks. One in particular is noted as being widely regarded as quite difficult or strange or unpredictable. And then you have others that are very nicely placed in the cultures in terms of where they would be most likely to crop up. Still, these are regarded as individual phenomena. There are no cultures/communities that are characterized as an ongoing reproductive population characterized by this. But on the other hand, one could look at this and say, given another century, that's going to be happening. And it's very disruptive to the current setup across the cultures. You see, the cultures are very different that I mentioned before. These cultures are really different from one another in terms of key cultural variables. Number one, how do we handle the dead? Some cultures recycle them with high tech. Some cultures recycle them with low tech. Some cultures eat them. Some cultures bury them or expose them to the elements. It's all very much a matter of that particular culture's ecological history. And then also slavery. Almost every nuance of historical slavery is represented across the cultures of Promised Sands, all the way from, and I particularly like the wet denizens, who will be very, very clear to you, and the dry denizens, they're very, very clear to you that they don't practice slavery. And then they clarify, well, no citizen is ever enslaved. And then you look at their prison system, and it is slavery. So stuff like that. There's some really pointed moments in there. And then there are groups where slavery is just a temporary thing that, if you get busted for a crime and then it's over with and you're not a slave anymore, and that's that. Others with much more hierarchical human chattel and commerce situations. So anyway, slavery is a big deal in this setting as a whole. The different cultures all address them very differently. So as you can see, the fact that the cultures are all butted up against each other and are now interacting in more or less a functional way in the first place is already full of interesting cultural differences. And that's nicely interplayed with the ethnic differences, and that they're not one-to-one. And then you have the half-breeds coming in as individuals, so to speak, appearing not by their own choice, obviously, and saying, who am I? The reason I'm going on and on about this as important is because I was intrigued and impressed by the cultural differences, and talked about this with the authors way back when, or one of them. One of the authors told me that he considered the half-breeds to be the heart of the game, that he could conceive of playing with all half-breeds, and that that struck me. I had noted them as receiving a curious amount of detail, and I mentioned that to him, and he was like, oh yeah, that's a big deal. So another example of, we have this panoply of almost traditional looking fantasy detail, and then you look again and you're like, oh, wait a minute, this is all about this. Could be all about this in a very fueling way.